Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Voters in Greece are headed to the polls today for a crucial election that could determine that country's future in the Eurozone. And Syrian opposition groups are urging the United Nations to send armed peacekeepers to that country after UN monitors suspended their work there due to intensifying violence. Right now, joining me today, we have Congressman Steve Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee, Michelle Bernard, founder, president, and CEO of the Bernard Center for Women, Politics, and Public Policy, former president of the Conservative Independent Women's Forum, Rolling Stone contributing editor Michael Hastings, also a correspondent for BuzzFeed, and Esther Armour returning to the table, host of WBAI-FM's Wake Up Call. All right, in dueling speeches on Thursday afternoon, Mitt Romney issued a series of conservative talking points about debt and Europe and big government, while President Obama made his own case, arguing that Romney and the current GOP regime are so extreme they have broken with over half a century of good faith political and economic norms.
There have been fierce arguments throughout our history between both parties about the exact size and role of government. Some honest disagreements. But in the decades after World War II, there was a general consensus that the market couldn't solve all of our problems on its own. It's this vision that Democrats and Republicans used to share that Mr. Romney and the current Republican Congress have rejected in favor of a no-holds-barred, government is the enemy, market is everything approach.
The president set out to define what this approach would look like: trillions in tax cuts for the wealthy, slashes to government jobs and services, millions of Americans losing their health care, and told voters if they liked what they heard to cast their ballot for Romney and the GOP agenda.
You should take them at their word, and they will take America down this path. And Mr. Romney is qualified to deliver on that plan. No, he is. I'm giving you an honest presentation of what he's proposing. Now, I'm looking forward to the press following up and making sure that you know I'm not exaggerating.
So I thought the speech was interesting because those two speeches came at a week. I thought two things kind of happening in the campaign this week. One was, earlier in the week, there was this panic button that was being pressed. James Carville said something about, oh, it's going off the rails. There are a few worrying poll numbers out. And the polls, Nate Silver had this hilarious tweet about sort of making fun of the different polling that was happening. He said, Obama's support cratered among elderly gay Hispanic Jews in the latest tracking poll. Margin of error plus or minus 87%. And the fact of the matter is, just to kind of put this to rest in terms of the panic button being pushed, here's the Gallup poll of Obama versus Romney. It's the tracking poll, April 15th to June 15th, if we could show that for a second. And what you will see is that is,
flatline.
It's flat. Exactly. It is essentially dead heat. It's basically a 50-50 nation at this point. And barring some huge shock that comes to the system from outside, it's this, we're going to grind it out. So that to me, and that put us all on the staff, that put us all in mind of this classic image, which I have to show. This is an image that was created in 2008 when, in the midst of the Republican convention and Sarah Palin being named, and before the bottom fell of the economy, there was a period where John McCain was polling ahead of Barack Obama. And there was just this wave of commentary from Democrats who were just like heading for the life rafts, like jumping off the ship, just total panic everywhere, which reminded me a little bit earlier this week. And then they made this by now iconic image. And I know staffers on the campaign that had that up at their desk. We blurred out the obvious word.
Wait, are you suggesting that the media is pushing the panic button and creating a false conflict that doesn't actually exist?
Never would I suggest something like that. No, but I think this week it was. I think one of the things that does happen, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Steve, because it's a long campaign. The fundamentals aren't going to change that much. There's not a lot to cover in certain ways. But I do think that the panic that we saw a little bit earlier this week seems to me part of the disposition of Democrats in campaigns, to start hitting the panic button, to start going to the press with off-the-record quotes about, oh, we're doing it wrong.
There may be some truth to that, but it is a long way to go. I was taught early, and maybe more local than national, elections are won in the last 10 days. Now, maybe that's spread out some in a national campaign and with social media and all, but it's toward the end. There's so many things that can affect this election in Europe. You know, the president was responsible for the price of gas, if you listen to the Congress 2 months ago, but then when gas has gone down, the president had nothing to do with it.
It's a very, very, very good point. Michael, how do you've been covering the campaign. Right. The other big thing to me that happened this week, and I thought was an interesting one, was Ryan Lizza published this big piece in the New Yorker about what a second term looks like. And part of the speech on Thursday was laying out a second term vision, and there's been a pivot to try to think about the vision for the future. How much is that an intentional strategic choice? Because they understand they cannot affect the economy between now and Election Day.
Well, look, I think that piece is essentially another way to make the case for an Obama second term, right? I mean, that's essentially what it's laying out. And it's funny, over the past 48 hours, I've been on the phone with some of the folks in the Obama campaign, and I quote them the Carvel line. And I have to say, the Obama people do not necessarily appreciate all the feedback they're getting from Clinton land. But I said to them, I said, look, you know, in 10, 20 years, you guys are going to be doing this to some Democratic president, too, so, you know, you should give these old guys a pass. Look, I think that in terms of Ryan's piece of laying out this vision for the second term, you have the environmental issue that's going to be key, and also on foreign policy side, because we know presidents have most control over their foreign policy, and in the second term for foreign policy is going to lay out this sort of grand strategic vision, deal more with China and issues like that, while also getting us out of these ground wars and sort of installing this sort of robust counter-terrorist apparatus. So, but I think it's a way to make the case for a second term in a kind of very clever way. I should
note though that the speech on Thursday, and I think the focus down the stretch, right, is going to be on the economy. And the Ohio speech, he basically said, yeah, he literally said, I don't have the speech in front of me, something like social issues are important, yes, foreign policy is important, but the core of this is going to be the economy.
You know, one of the things I found fascinating about the piece in the New Yorker and about the president's speech is that it makes the case for what the country may look like in an Obama second term. And I think it's essential to do that because right now the president is having a great deal of difficulty, obviously, with a Republican government, divided government, in turning the economy around, in getting legislation passed. So the only thing that he can really talk about is for every single human being, every single person that lives in the country, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, here's what the country looks like if I get a second term. Here's why you are so important. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what my legacy is. And it's a way to get his base excited again.
But he needs to get his base to realize that it has to be more than Obama. He needs to have Speaker Pelosi.
See, this is I'm so glad you said that, because he got a line in the speech where he said, we have a stalemate, and this is your chance to break the stalemate.
Yes.
Chance to break the stalemate is only true if you do not recreate the current conditions of divided government, because then you're going to have more stalemate. We know what that looks like, and I think that's the interesting thing, because to lay out a vision of what a second term looks like is obviously highly contingent on the Republican in Congress that'll work with it.
Right. It's also saying don't hold the next 5 months against me. You know, whatever happens at the end of the summer, if the economy takes, don't hold that against me. Remember, we're looking for the future.
I think it's also about, very specifically, a battle that's ideology versus the record. And that we're in this moment where the economic record, which may be of getting better slowly, but the last figures don't look so good when it comes to the jobs numbers, mean that the ideology, which is going back to the 2008 campaign, is the way to move the country in a particular direction, because the record ain't going to do it. And I think the Obama administration understands that the record cannot do it, that Romney and the Republicans can beat them up every single time, but also because when it comes to ideology, Obama can fairly argue that the Republicans are in this intimate relationship with political paralysis that actually affects every single one of you watching this. If you think you're going to stand on the sidelines, then you're in the same relationship with paralysis that the Romney campaign is.
And they've got to remember that the economy is the Bush economy. It's Bush and the Republicans who ruined this economy, and Romney is a replay of that. And that's why the President says if you like what you had then, you got it more now.
But that's not what people feel, because I think part of the challenge has been, although the political paralysis has been on the side of the Republicans, that people blame the Democrats and the Obama administration for failing to act more aggressively.
I know that, and maybe it could be, it's like Men in Black. and you got to not erase their memories. You got to remember it was Bush.
And that's a good point. And I would push back on that a little bit, because I think we've seen polling that says it still remains the case. A majority of people, primarily blaming Bush for the state of the economy. Now that's come down over time, which one would assume. Right. But I think it's both, right? There's not a zero sum of blame. I mean, if people are frustrated, they can hand out the blame cards to everyone. And in fact, what you see is people are not very happy with Congress, right? They really dislike Congress. Yeah. The president is battling right around 50%, and they also think Bush was the worst president in recent memory. So it's like there's plenty of blame to go around.
It's sort of like a pox on both your houses. Where we're really sick. We're really sick of all of you. And
that's the danger.
That's the danger, and the other danger for the president this campaign season is it's very difficult to explain to the American public how much worse things could be.
That's how do you the counterfactual argument.
Exactly.
And I want to talk about how the economic record, cuts both ways for Congress and for Republican governors right after we take this break. Talking about President's speech on Thursday, Mitt Romney's speech on Thursday, and the vision for the campaign at this moment in terms of moving the focus to the second term, a vision for a second term. And Congressman, here's something I'd like you to address, which is one of the things that has broken down in the normal mechanics of Democratic accountability under the lockstep Republican House is that you have a sense that, sure, there's an incentive to obstruct the president, right, because he's from the other party. But that's balanced by incentive to deliver something in terms of tangible goods, because you yourself have to stand for re-election, right? I mean, every member of Congress has to go home in the House and run for re-election. And if things are really terrible, presumably you're worried about voters holding you accountable for that, and it seems that the Republicans just don't think that's the case, that they can defy that gravity and convince their voters when they have to go back to their districts in the next 6 months and run for re-election that they're not going to be held accountable for the same problems they're blaming on the president.
A lot of districts are in the primaries, and in the Republican primary, doing nothing is wonderful. So those people will be okay, and the people that elected Tea Party people, those folks like doing nothing. The concern that I think they should have, and I think they're going to see, is that people realize, like Ornstein said in his recent, I guess it was a book, but he said, it's the Republicans that are causing the problem. It's not Democrat, and it's Republicans, and so they're going to be blamed more than the Democrats, and I think they're coming around some.
But what I'm hearing from you is the nature of gerrymandering means that most of these Republicans don't have to worry about competitive races. They have to worry about primary challenges from Tea Party insurgents. But there's some group of, there are enough swing districts that Congress has changed hands twice in the span of 4 years. It did in 2006, it did in 2010. Someone has to be worried about getting reelected, right? I mean, if the country's in bad shape, that usually bodes ill for incumbents, and it seems to me like that political gravity is being defied.
But you've got a lot of neophytes. A lot of the Tea Party people are first-time people to government. They want to get rid of government, and they're not thinking the traditional way of compromise and make things work, because they don't want to. They're ideologues, and they haven't really thought about re-election because they've never had a re-election.
But is there space then? Does that open up space for competitive?
Well, I think it does. I think the Democrats can take back the Congress. There's a limited number of seats because of redistricting. Redistricting made this more difficult than ever. Right. But I think there's a chance we can get it back. You saw Barber, Gabby's aide win in Arizona. I think that the people are going to say, we want to keep Social Security as we know it. We want to keep Medicaid as we know it. And George Romney would just be abominable. I mean, if you wanted Niedermeyer as president.
Mitt Romney.
Niedermeyer. Yeah, Mitt Romney.
George Romney actually wouldn't be too bad. Let's be clear here.
But, and it's interesting, but he's the automobile industry, and the president saved the automobile industry. But he'll be Niedermeyer. And I'm not saying our guy's Blutarski, but
explain this reference to our.
There was this great movie that probably still around called Animal House, and Niedermeyer was the head of the fraternity that liked to blackball people, and the elitist kind of uptight conservative guy that is the typical stereotype.
I believe your audience is familiar with Animal House.
I just want to make sure. You don't know with our audience.
My observation is that for many Republicans that are in Congress right now, they actually feel like they are doing something, and they feel like they are delivering in the sense that by obstructing everything that the president wants to do, even at the risk of completely destroying the economic well-being of the country, that they are delivering for their district. The problem is it won't be until they actually succeed in destroying the economy that they get put out of office. That's the problem.
And I think it goes to 2 points. It goes to your Men in Black point, the ability to erase memory and literally recreate the record. Because paralysis has been effective insofar as it has definitely created, to some extent, I think, a feeling that there is an impotence among the Democrats. And I think the tightness of the polling reflects that to some degree. And so that paralysis is not inaction. That's a strategy as well. Whether or not it becomes a winning strategy is a whole other conversation, but it is a strategy. The question as to how far they can take it, but then I look at Wisconsin and what happened there. Even though it was a historic recall vote, the ways in which the Republicans are willing to kind of fly into action reveal that that paralysis has an end game, and they're willing and able and ready to move when they have to.
The other way that the economic record cuts in different directions is that the recovery, such as it is, which again, I don't think there's a person, it's hard, I think, to find a person in the country who thinks the economy is just going awesome right now, and that, you know, we just can call it a win and walk away. But the recovery is very unevenly distributed geographically. And there's a really interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about how this creates interesting political dynamics in states where you have a pretty strong recovery happening in Ohio that the Republican Governor John Kasich wants to take credit for. Pretty strong economic recovery happening in Virginia, where Republican Governor Bob McDonnell is running ads saying, hey, things are going really well. And then the question is, well, at the same time, you know, you have John Kasich saying things in Ohio are looking up, and Mitt Romney comes to the state to say everything is terrible.
Right, and Romney's trying to convince people in Ohio he has to say it's not going that well, because obviously that helps him. But back to the Obama campaign and the sort of central tension we're going to see play out over the next few months. It's managing expectations about the economy. And this is where the Carville criticism comes from. This is where even people who are very strong Obama allies have been saying this for the past few weeks, that if the president comes out and says everything is looking good, everything is fine, they're going to set themselves up in case things go badly.
And I think they've learned that lesson, because I think there's been, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the way this recovery or non-recovery or sort of ambling along has happened is that there have been a number of moments where it looked like we were about to get escape velocity, right? And there was a recovery spring, and even this winter looked quite good. Actually, I was saying on this program, it looked like we're really starting to take off. And so I think they've learned their lesson. I want to read a quote from an one of the top Obama strategists that made me absolutely panicked about what the White House has learned about the Republican Congress right after this break.
Time for the Your Business Entrepreneur.
All right, welcome back. I had not mentioned it's Father's Day, so I want to say happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. Dad, we'll hang out later. So this is the quote I just said. There's a quote that I read, and this is from the Ryan Lizza piece that was in New York, a really interesting piece. Ryan is a great reporter, I think, and always delivers very in-depth looks at what's going on behind the scenes. This is David Plouffe talking to Ryan Lizza in the New Yorker about exactly what we've been discussing, which is there's the presidential election, but of course there's Congress and the consequences of divided government and the consequences of a Republican Party that is implacably committed to destroying the president and to blocking any possible chance at any improvement or compromise, etc. David Plouffe says, if both chambers are more evenly divided, it could be a recipe for actually getting some things done. Because of the closeness, neither party is going to be able to do anything on its own, so either zero gets done for 2 years or there is a kind of center. What have you been watching for the last 2 years? I mean, Congressman, you work in Congress. Does that strike you as completely out of touch with the reality of what it seems to me they still have not grasped the nature of the opposition.
Well, I think you're right, because the Republicans do not want, they want to, A, what McConnell said, we want to defeat this president, but B, they've got a different ideology. They want to destroy all the regulations that control the financial markets, the regulations that give you clean water and clean air, chance to breathe. I mean, they want totally free market, and they don't care about it, and they want to just get rid of the tax. They want the rich to become richer,
But wait a second. It's not even that, because those are affirmative visions. Because you know, it's one thing to have an affirmative vision, right? And you know, Mitt Romney's laid out what his budget is, whatever. But right now what we are seeing is just a party line opposition to anything getting done that could possibly improve the economy in the short term. So just from the perspective of economic management, for the perspective of cutting some grand bargain on the budget for years to go out.
But that quote shows that, as you know, as much as the Republicans are in this intimate relationship with paralysis, the Democrats are in an intimate relationship with delusion.
They're not understanding it.
Yeah. And David Plouffe is deeply involved in the management of this second term and the campaign. And to be so off base and so far away from the reality of what has happened.
It's away from the reality of Congress, but it's not away from the reality of trying to get that small independent vote that wants to think that we need to work with both sides.
The question is, does he believe this?
No,
right?
I'm talking to campaign people all the time, and all they say is privately, you know, the Republicans are obstructionists. We can't work with them. They're trying to defeat everything the president is trying to do. So I think with a quote like that in a major, you know, piece of magazine journalism, there's a bit of the, you know, wishful thinking. This is a campaign improved, you know, hope.
But let's remember one of the first press conferences that the president gave after Republicans took the House. And Mark Ambender, who was then with The Atlantic, got up and said, you know, there's this debt ceiling that you're going to hit later this year. And how's that going to work? Are you going to be able to get the Republican votes for that? And the president said, looked him in the face and said, I think they're going to have responsibility now that having actual power is going to change them, and they will not recklessly drive the car off the cliff. Fast forward 6 months, and the entire nation in the car as it speeds towards the cliff. And I think that, you know, that debt ceiling moment, I thought, would open everybody's eyes about what the nature of this dynamic is. And I'll say this, you know, there's not a member of the Republican Party per se sitting at the table. You know, they are pursuing a vision that I think is to the detriment of the country. But, you know, I don't know how I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and think they actually think it's better in the long run because they think Barack Obama is so bad. But they are pursuing it with total discipline and zealousness.
But I think we shouldn't underestimate the Republicans' commitment to the politics of winning. Like, the reality of what it means to win is not just about the destruction of the Obama administration, it's the destruction of President Obama himself. I think part of this is absolutely personal, and so that it is not that they don't accept that the strategy that they're pursuing may not be to the detriment of the country, but the reality is they're offsetting that with the reality is if this means we're going to win, there's no way that we will not stray off that course. There's no way we will abandon that discipline.
But you have to ask yourself, a reasonable person has to ask, how do you possibly...
This is not about being reasonable, this is about winning.
True, and it's also about a party where now, if you're called a moderate, that's a bad thing. But how do you win if you disenfranchise African Americans, you attack women, you attack Hispanics, you basically attack most of the country as we know it today, and you say to yourself, this is a winning strategy. I mean... It makes no sense.
Agreed, and yet we see what the tracking polls are. I mean, the fact of the matter is the defining feature of the electorate continues to be polarization. It continues to be the fact that there's not a lot of space left over to battle for, you know, the mythical swing voter, the unicorn that we all hunt.
But that also shows very specifically that the Republicans understand we're not willing to confront, and that is the fact that the polls are so tight when everything you've just said is 101% true means there's something else that the Republicans are willing to explore that we are not facing. Because the reality is when you war against women the way the Republicans have, when you are literally creating this assault against the Voting Rights Act, which is disenfranchising African Americans from voting, when you are against the DREAM Act, which is the Latino swing vote, you're against all of those things. Those polls at the beginning that you showed were at a dead heat. How is that possible with those truths?
Well, let me say one thing, and then you've queued up very nicely something we're going to talk about next, which is it's not. Let's just be clear here. Disenfranchising African American voters is an entirely rational, if morally odious, way of strategy for the Republicans to pursue. I mean, we know one of the bedrock facts about American politics is that, particularly in the era of Obama, African Americans are going to vote 9-1 more or less for the president and not against Republicans, right? And against Republicans. And so if you can take voters like that off the table in a swing state like Florida, if you can get 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 of those voters not to show up who are voting 9-1 against you, you know, it's reprehensible from the perspective of everything that we believe about equality and democracy and self-governance. But just morally neutrally as a strategy, it's not a dumb strategy, right? I mean, let's be clear.
But the Democrats then need an equally strong strategy to reach out to all of these groups to say, in their vision for the future of America, you don't count. You mean zero.
Right, but I think a lot of that I guess my point is that pie feels like it's already been sliced. You know what I mean? Like who people had sort of figured out which team they're on, and that's why this election is going to be 2000 all over again. We're going to be up at 5 in the morning, and there's going to be like 9 votes in some county.
Absolutely.
And one of the only place that I think there is some wiggle room is one of the big places there is wiggle room is among Latinos and Hispanic voters.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the game-changing moment for President Obama on immigration from this week, right after this.
These days, you're...
Big policy change announced by President Obama on Friday. Huge news will allow undocumented immigrants who were brought to the United States as children to remain in the country. Unlike the original DREAM Act, legislation that I remember covering back in 2002, looks like it might pass. It was introduced in 2001. The president's new policy does not award permanent legal status. Here's how he described it.
Effective immediately, the Department of Homeland Security is taking steps to lift the shadow of deportation from these young people. Over the next few months, eligible individuals who do not present a risk to national security or public safety will be able to request temporary relief from deportation proceedings and apply for work authorization. Now, let's be clear. This is not amnesty. This is not immunity.
He's right, because the president cannot citizenship to thousands without Congress's approval. What President Obama has done is put forth what is essentially a watered-down version of the DREAM Act, and it is also, not coincidentally, very similar to the plan Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio is proposing.
The plan basically would award kids who meet a certain criteria, they got here by a certain age, have lived here, graduated from high school, don't have a criminal record, want to go to college. They'd get what in essence is a student visa and thereafter a work visa. And after some period of time, probably 10 years, we would then allow them to access the immigration system just like any non-immigrant visa holder in the United States would.
With the president in effect calling Republicans bluff on this issue, Mitt Romney was left to twist and dodge, and other Republicans tried to attack the president while being careful not to actually attack the substance of the policy. Senator John McCain accused the president of adding confusion and uncertainty to the issue, and Senator Chuck Grassley said the president's action is a, quote, affront to the process of representative government, unquote. Joining us now is Loretta Praeli, an undocumented immigrant on the coordinating committee of United We Dream. She is also a recent college graduate. It's great to have you back.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
How are you feeling? We had you here, I think about a month and a half ago at the table. You had just actually met with Marco Rubio, and this was in a political context in which we saw some of the rhetoric on the Republican side in the primary. Let me give a little look at what that rhetoric was sounding like in the Republican primary. Here's Mitt Romney talking about immigration on the campaign trail.
Amnesty is a magnet. When we have had in the past programs that have said that people who've come here illegally are going to get to stay illegally for the rest of their life, that's going to only encourage more people to come here illegally. But in order to bring people in legally, we've got to stop illegal immigration. That means turning off the magnets of amnesty, in-state for illegal aliens, employers that knowingly hire people that have come here illegally. It is bringing in people who in some cases can be terrorists. In other cases, they become burden on our society. And we have to finally have immigration laws that protect our border.
Right, you're making notes about being a burden on society.
I'm wondering how he defines that.
Yeah, well, what is interesting is that was the rhetoric during the primary, and you don't see that rhetoric anymore. You see Marco Rubio meeting with you and fellow advocates to say, well, maybe we can find some compromise. And then this huge announcement yesterday that did not precipitate a big Republican backlash. What does that say to you about where the conversation has moved?
I think we're in a completely different place in this country. So I think many things have happened that have led to this moment. I think it's important to recognize the role that Senator Rubio has played. He's opened up a lot of space for this to happen, for the conversation to take place. And I think the country is finally recognizing the presence of Dream Youth, the contributions that we have made, and the contributions that we look forward to making now that we can kind of execute our professional degrees.
I want you to talk about the movement that you have been part of and helped put together, and walk us through the arc of this administration, which began with doubling down on enforcement, record deportations, and has moved steadily in a direction that has culminated, for now, with Friday's announcement. How do we get from there to here?
It's been a long journey. So there's this sense that, you know, this just happened all of a sudden and out of nowhere. This has been years of work by people who have done it before I got on board. So there was the Trail of Dreams early in 2010 where 4 dreamers walked from Florida to Washington, D.C. to deliver this same message. Not even just about the DREAM Act, this specific message to the president.
Which is to stop deporting people who are DREAM eligible, would be DREAM eligible.
Exactly. So I think we realized at the end of 2010 that people weren't ready for this. America was ready for this, but Congress wasn't ready to act. Or not ready, they were unwilling to act. I think it's important to say that. Fell 5 votes short of passing. And so we had to figure out what can actually happen in this country and what do we do to make it happen. And that's where we said, well, the executive has the authority, the legal authority to do what we're asking him to do.
So there was actually a change of strategy from a congressional strategy to an executive strategy.
Absolutely.
That's interesting.
The congressional I mean, for us, you know, a permanent solution can only be achieved in Congress.
Right.
And we're very aware of that. We're committed to making that happen. But in the meantime, in the interim, the president can act, and he's done his job. You know, him speaking on Friday, that was huge. And now he just has to implement this fully the way that he's described it.
I want to talk about the implementation. I want to talk about the previous attempt to implement a similar policy, which did not work very well, and what separates this. And we'll also talk to a member of Congress who has been at the forefront of pushing for not only the DREAM Act, but comprehensive immigration reform right after this.
Put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you've done everything right your entire life. Studied hard, worked hard, maybe even graduated at the top of your class, only to suddenly face the threat of deportation to a country that you know nothing about, with a language that you may not even speak.
That's the president making the empathetic case for why this is a just right thing to do. Of course, those deportations were happening under his watch and accelerated, right? I mean, that was where this started in terms of the Obama administration, and we ended up here. You talked about the strategy of people pushing for the DREAM Act changing from Congress to the president. When you made that strategic shift, how did you try to apply that pressure and to push for this?
I mean, I think we had done that last year, and then it wasn't until this year, the beginning of this year, that we said, okay, we need to kind of redefine what we're doing. Jose Antonio Vargas's writing has really helped us and opened up and shifted the narrative in this country in many ways. And so once we decided to develop an internal and an external strategy, we had a National Day of Action May 17th, so we were making this an issue. We were raising awareness about this. And then internally, we were also meeting with White House officials, with Senator Rubio, and with many folks. And it's important to say that I think a big turning point was when 96 professors, the brightest legal minds in this country, wrote a letter to President Obama saying, you have the liberty to do this.
Yes.
There was no longer a question about the legal objection here.
I want to bring in Congressman Luis Gutierrez, a Democrat from Illinois, who's been incredibly active on this issue for a long time, since I covered him back in Chicago. Congressman, it's great to have you. Thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Chris, this morning.
I want to get your reaction to the president's announcement on Friday, both
sure.
What it means for people, what it means politically, and what it means for the prospects of actual congressional action on this going forward.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate the President of the United States for taking this step. I know he didn't want to do it. I know that his friends, his allies, people who care a great deal about his success, because we believe that his success is America's success, engaged him forcefully in a conversation and in a dialogue, and in the end, he sided with us. That sometimes is not very easily done. We met with him in December of 2010, and I do want to put this in perspective. We passed the DREAM Act in the House of Representatives, right. 216 to 198. 8 Republicans joined 208 Democrats. You know what? 51 Democratic senators 2 weeks later in the Senate said we're for the DREAM Act with 4 Republicans. They stopped it from happening. So I think we need to put it in perspective. Yes. And then we met with the president just days before Christmas in 2010. And the president said to us, I am going to take steps to protect the immigrant community from an executive, but we need to discuss that. We took the memorandum to the president in February of 2011, and we said, you have the executive authority. We had 3 general counsels of the INS. We had ample background. The president has, from a legislative point of view, 1997, the immigration reform, that the authority to do this. And so we said, Mr. President, use it. As you remember, last August, he issued his memorandum for discretion. Many dreamers, their deportations were canceled on the basis of that. But you know what? Many were still being caught up in the immigration system. Millions of American citizen children, their parents were being deported and separated, and they had no criminal background. And we needed to fix this immigration system. So we continue to engage this president. I mean, Senator Durbin and what Senator... The problem many times in understanding how it is something arrives before the public is that, you know, we engage the president privately. We engage the president many times quietly, and many times I haven't done it quietly. but in this case, we said, you know what we think is important is to reach the goal. And so I just want to say that, you know, we had to meet with Jana Napolitano. I mean, there were those of us that were this close, Chris, to simply asking for her resignation. Senator Bob Menendez and Senator Durbin, and the kind of work that they did needs to be heralded and needs to be acknowledged in this process. So I'm very proud to be part of a process that has begun over 10 years ago to bring about comprehensive immigration reform and to say this is important. And let me just try to suggest to you, from the immigrant community's perspective, immigration reform is a human rights struggle, a civil rights struggle. So I want you to think in 60 days when the DREAM students, 800,000 strong, are going to be able to apply for a work visa. It's like 800,000 gay men and women being able to get married, or 800,000 African Americans finally be able to vote. It's going to be significant, and I want to thank the president for taking that kind of step
Congressman,
forward.
I want you to stay with us because we're going to talk about not only what produced Friday, but where we go from here right after this break. We have Congressman Luis Gutierrez on the line, and we have Lorella Praile here talking about how Friday's announcement of the president's immigration policy for dreamers, dream-eligible young folks like yourself who came here as children, how that came about. When you started, the Congressman talked about pressure on the inside, pressure on the outside, conversations in the White House, very loud conversations happening outside the White House. Were there people telling you to back off when you started going?
Absolutely. I would say even many progressives were telling us, don't do this. It's an important year. You don't want to put the spotlight on the president. And we were saying we don't work for President Obama, Democrats, or the Republicans. We have a responsibility to our community. And there's an opportunity here. The president should be doing his job. And we're going to go after that.
The irony, of course, is that in pushing the president to make this decision, Congressman, what you saw from the Republican reaction says a lot to me about actually this not just being the right policy on the merits, but being the right policy politically, because the reaction gives it away in that sense.
It does, Chris. Let me suggest to you that getting arrested in front of the White House 2 years in a row after we worked so hard to elect this president was not easy, but I think it was important. Not just I, but many activists for the last 3.5 years have been around this country challenging this president. But let me just say that the action he took from a person who has been very critical of this president and has publicly stated this, that the action he took is significant and meaningful, and it is already beginning from the moment he made that announcement to heal the kind of fraying that occurred between a huge Latino community that came out in gangbusters in 2008 to help elect him president. and moving forward. And yes, you see the Republicans. So now you see this very stark contrast. One that we wanted. What did Latinos want? They wanted him to fight. They wanted him to shine a light on injustice and unfairness and to be our champion. And what he did Friday was say, I'm your champion. And you know what? Whether it may come a little later than you wanted, but he is our champion. And that's what people wanted to see him do. So you got Mitt Romney, who says that the Dreamers should simply self-deport and that he would veto the DREAM Act. And you have a Barack Obama who is saying, I will use the authority that I have as president to make sure you can stay here. Because what we have to do is stop the deportation, because this will allow us to incorporate. Don't think that after we pass comprehensive immigration reform, we'll do. Eventually, we're simply going to say, oh, we were just kidding, why don't you just come on back?
Right.
No, once you're deported, you are basically gone from the system.
And in some ways, I think the irony of this whole thing is that I think from talking to folks around the White House and some of the advocates also, the White House thought that the increasing of deportation, doubling down on enforcement, was going to create the political space to move things through Congress. I mean, the president said that explicitly in the State of the Union. He said to Congress, I've gotten tough on immigration, so now we can have this conversation. But of course, that was not how it played out.
It wasn't how it played out because Republicans don't want to see action.
Right.
In 2004, I and Senator McCain, Senator Kennedy introduced comprehensive. It was bipartisan, it was bicameral, and my colleague, Congressman Flake, was the co-sponsor with me, right? We did it together in the House. It was Flake, Gutierrez, and then when we took over the majority, it was Gutierrez, Flake. And now Congressman Flake is out there in Arizona campaigning as though that never happened. And of course, he'd like nothing better than for me to go and denounce him, because he probably, and rightfully so, thinks that might help him. But you have to understand, we no longer have that partnership. So the president had to act because Congress would not.
Congressman, I want you to stick around because I want to talk about the possibility of this being something that happens in the second term. And there's a really interesting quote that was given in an article this week that suggested that might be the case. I also want to talk about a little bit of heckling on the White House lawn right after we come back. Hello from New York, I'm Chris Hayes. With me this morning, I have Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee, Lorella Praeli from the immigrant advocacy group Connecticut Students for a Dream, Rolling Stone Magazine's Michael Hastings, and Esther Arma from New York's WBAI-FM. We also have Congressman Luis Gutierrez live in Chicago. Lorella, I wanted you to explain a little bit, we have to get too into the weeds of the way this is not an executive order, we should mention, first of all. That was being reported as an executive order. It's not an executive order. It is a cabinet-level directive that comes from Janet Napolitano, and it is an update. It is different than the memo of prosecutorial discretion, which was issued earlier this year, which was basically saying, hey, frontline immigration workers who are dealing with who we should go after and who we shouldn't, these are the metrics you should use to decide whether it's a smart use of the government's resources to go after person A, Lorella Praeli, for instance. And it basically said, look, if you have someone in your circumstance, a dreamer, don't deport them. And that was insufficient, right? There was a lot of problem at the ground level getting that to flow through the bureaucracy and be implemented. So how's announcement on Friday differ, and what difference is it making in the lives of folks right now?
This is a class basis of deferred action, basically, and that is just discretionary determination to defer the removal action of an individual as prosecutorial discretion.
Okay, what does that mean?
And that basically means that it's a stopgap measure. It's a temporary relief for a specific group of folks.
And the point is that the assumption is that anyone who meets the criteria, right, they can actually affirmatively apply. That's the key difference, right? It's not that they just have to sit and hope that there's no knock on the door, right? They can affirmatively apply and get immigration papers that allow them to stay in the country legally, even if it's not citizenship.
Right. This does not confer someone lawful status, but what it does is it protects someone, right? It protects this category of individuals from being deported, from living a life of fear, and from being able to live their lives fully. So this is huge for people, for the dreamers who have been fighting for this. The president is finally exercising his discretionary authority.
Michael.
Well, I mean, stepping back a little, as obviously there's lives at stake, and you know, obviously these policies are going to be very critical for how this plays out for a generation of undocumented workers. But as the kind of horse race political guy at the table at the moment,
what's it do for the polling,
yeah,
Michael?
what's it do for the polling? Exactly. One of the most amazing things this week has watching the Obama campaign send out email after email calling this another Mitt Romney Etch-a-Sketch moment.
Right.
And what they mean by that is that we are actually seeing in real time, in excruciating detail, how Mitt Romney is flip-flopping on this critical issue.
Right.
This was a guy who, back during the primaries, as you showed earlier in the clip, who was savagely against any kind of immigration reform, who, when Rick Perry even suggested that you show some compassion, blew a gasket and then made it.
Let's remember that the way Rick Perry, right, was going to be the great hope, right? And he showed up. And basically, Mitt Romney pulled out this machete called the DREAM Act, which had been passed in Texas, and he just stuck it in Rick Perry's gut over and over and totally dispatched him from the race using this issue by demagoguing on this issue, saying you're giving hundreds of thousands of dollars of discounted tuition to illegals. So let's just remember the context here.
Exactly. And now he's like, well, Marco Rubio says this, I'm going to hide behind Marco Rubio.
Right.
I mean, it's been amazing.
I think also another really important point for me was the political capital that the president is absolutely going to gain with Latinos in Florida, which is a huge swing state for the general election. Because when in his State of the Union address, he literally spoke about he's going to up the deportations, and we saw record numbers in 2011. He was now playing politics with the Republican Party about, if I do this for you, then maybe I can gain something from you. But what he had done was abandon the mandate of the people that had put him into office in the first place. And with this movement, he's literally switched back to the direction of the people. And I wanted to ask you about what that's going to mean, not just for the Latino vote, but for capturing his 2008 hope and change kind of platform that he ran.
If I could, Chris.
Please, Congressman.
I think it's important to understand that 2 million more Latinos voted in 2008 than 2004.
Exactly.
That 500,000 Latinos turn 18 every year, and they've been doing that for the last 3.5 years. Let me tell you what this is going to allow him to do. And I think this is important. This is a significant move on his part, gesture on his part, initiative on his part, that a whole community of people, you know what they're going to see during September and October, the 2 months before the election? They're going to see up to 800,000 people who we know. I mean, these are our family members. Right. We go to church with, school with them. They're an integral part of who we are. And the community is going to say, God, there are 11 million undocumented. We care for them all. What a great, courageous first step. So they're going to see them gaining relief. And the difference was, when we first got the prosecutorial discretion, we were so angry and frustrated because just like the Barack Obama administration, they'll do a little bit. So what they said is, if we catch you, dreamer, right, we'll let you go if you apply for prosecutorial discretion. This is an affirmative action, as you suggest, Chris. Now they don't have to wait to get caught. In 60 days, they'll be able to kind of turn themselves in. And as they turn themselves in, they'll be gaining a work permit, a driver's license, and be able to integrate. And let me just say, it's renewable for another 2 years. But what we have to understand, I think, also is there are 11 million. And just like the wonderful young graduate student that you have on your program this morning, who I want to congratulate and all for their tenacity, for their creativity, for the vigor in which they've engaged us all in this debate, I want to say I want her mom. I want her dad, and the millions of moms and dads that are out there to one day also to be able to live free in this country, and we need to continue to work on that.
That brings me, Congressman and Lorella, and I'd like you to sort of close on this, which is it's the question of the prospects for actual comprehensive reform, right? Because the president did have the authority to do this based on findings of a bunch of legal professors and strong arguments that this is well within the bounds of the executive. But any kind of permanent change to the landscape is going to have to come through Congress. Very quickly, here's a quote from Ryan Lizza. The White House is so convinced of the centrality of Hispanics to the current election and its aftermath that Plouffe told me he had been preparing for months for an onslaught of advertisements from a pro-Romney group attacking Obama from the left on immigration. arguing Obama's deportation policies had been too draconian. In that same article, right, worried about being attacked from the left, they imagine a scenario in which Barack Obama is reelected and Republicans, having once again gotten killed among Latino voters, finally understand that they have to do something about that, and that creates the conditions for comprehensive immigration reform in the second term. Congressman, do you see that as a likely scenario?
I do. I do see it because you know what? I really see this step and the election is really getting everybody ready. The election will be over. We'll have 4 years. The president will make this an initiative that is important to him and his legacy. And let me just say, I remember in September of 2010, it was Harry Reid fighting for his life out in Nevada, saying we're going to support the dream. And he got savagely attacked for 2 months. And you know what? He won that election. We won Colorado. We won California. And we kept the majority in the Senate because Democrats stood up for immigrants. The president is going to stand up for immigrants and Latinos. You have to understand, I think you have to understand one thing is that Latinos look at you first and say, are you being kind?
Right.
And are you being good with immigrants? And if you are, I will listen to you on other issues. The president has taken a bold step, and he's going to be rewarded, I know, very handsomely.
People are very good in politics at figuring out who's on their side. Congressman Luis Gutierrez, Democrat from Illinois, and Lorella Praeli from the immigrant advocacy group Connecticut Students for a Dream. Thank you both for your time this morning. Really great. What changing demographics mean for the presidential election and the nation, right after this. Ta-Nehisi, I want to read you this quote from Marion Barry, because the fact of the matter is, look, I mean, politics, I mean, look, I grew up in the Bronx, right, and my dad was a community organizer, and I grew up in New York. I lived in Chicago, I lived in D.C. City politics to me are, in some ways, the most fascinating politics, because that is like, that's where like the most raw stuff is happening, right? It's like, these people look like me, and those people don't, and these people have jobs, and these people don't, and it's like that, you have real conflict there, and the ways that cities, when they do succeed in managing that conflict to create the wonderful diversity that we all love, is incredible. But the flip side of it can be a lot of tension and conflict. And this is Marion Barry saying, talking about gentrification in March 2001, saying, we're going to stop this trend, gentrification. The key to keeping this city black is jobs, jobs for black people so they can have a better quality of life, the neighborhoods in the city. I believe in integration, but I don't believe in the apartheid we have in Ward 8. He's talking about a specific neighborhood in the city. Is keeping a city black a proper or appropriate goal?
No. No, and especially not appropriate in or proper in D.C. I don't think. I think the key is opportunity, and if you look at why D.C. is experiencing these demographic trends, which go back to Marion Barry's mayorship, it needs to be pointed out. It's because a lot of African Americans have gained some amount of wealth, moved out to Prince George's County. I believe Prince George's County is the only jurisdiction in the country that got richer and blacker at the same time. So, I mean, we have to be really, really careful about this. You know, obviously I'm very liberal, you know, want there to be equality of opportunity, as we often talk about, but we need to make sure that's exactly what we're you know, when we discuss this, that's what we're talking about. I need to add in something else, too. Watching this turn with Marion Barry particularly, I mean, most people know him as the mayor who smoked crack. That's how he's known. Right. He used to be something much more than a kind of doctrinaire nationalist, borderline racist. So watching him go into this sort of rhetoric where what he's really talking about is preserving his own political... But I mean, that's his ultimate goal.
But ethnic demagoguery in cities is always about that, at a certain level, right?
Well, he was a little better than this at one point, actually. I mean...
But, you know, I look back, I look back, first of all, wanting to keep a city black is not, it's not a proper goal. It's not a moral goal. Washington, D.C. has been fondly known for so many years as Chocolate City, but because it's predominantly African American, but also because there also are large numbers of African Americans that live in the city that are highly educated, that are doing very, very well. They are raising their children. Their children have access to excellent education, and it seems to me that if we're going to talk about how we sort of stave this off, you know, no, government can't come in and say when white people move into the neighborhood and housing prices go up, we're just going to make sure that they don't go up too high. What the proper role of government here should be, and a city mayor should be, and state legislators should be, as well as the federal government should be, is to make sure that we put every single American in a place where they are able to get a great education and be able to move forward and realize the American dream.
And also afford housing. I mean, I think one of the issues Well, that's not what the policy framework is right now. I just want to make this point, is that if you state it as keeping a city black, I think that sort of sets off certain alarm bells. Right. If you say there are people living in these places that have ties to these places, and, you know, dense neighborhoods near jobs and transportation are good places to live, and particularly for folks that don't have a lot of other opportunities, we don't want to push them out to the extremities, right? Which is also something we've seen happening, and that's what our policy framework now.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I grew up in Prince George's County, right on the northeast corner of Washington, D.C., and, you know, without revealing my birthday, all I can remember is, you know, which is fine, 1960, but but I feel like my entire teenage years and childhood, you could sense not only the change, but the tension in the change. But the reason I bring that up is not to make it personal in any way, that there's a scenario where over that period of time, suburbs and cities were changing, and the mechanics of that was legal, political, economic, social, and everything else. It tends to get discussed largely, I think, on the social level. In other words, that friction you're discussing, you are not like me, you have a job, I don't have a job, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what I always feel like is a huge struggle is bringing more of a public discourse up to the level of the mechanics of exactly what's going on, so that people can discuss it less confrontationally.
Let's talk about the policy and not necessarily as something. I mean, that's a really good point, right? Segregation wasn't just revealed natural preference, right? It was a set of policy frameworks. But Congressman, I want to bring you into this conversation because you have this unique role in American political life. Right? It really is. It's a unique role in American political life, which is that you are the only white member of Congress who represents a majority black district, and so your entire political life is transcending the kind of politics that we see sometimes in their worst incarnation at the city level.
I think in Memphis we've seen my constituency show that race has become less important. It's still important, but it's less important, and they respond to issues and to commitment and to results. And in Memphis, we don't have so much gentrification. We were blessed with, cursed with, and then blessed with a lot of non-developed space in the downtown area. And it's something, if you've seen, Henry Turley did this phenomenal job and developed housing, which is integrated downtown. And it was a new place, and people had opportunity to move in, and they were economically privileged. But it's been in integrated communities in downtown and uptown.
That's one of the points made when you go through the list of that they're showing right now, the whitening zip codes, is that a lot of those are places that haven't gone from Roanoke, for instance, downtown Roanoke. It wasn't that downtown Roanoke was majority black and now it's majority white. It was no one was living in downtown Roanoke and then a bunch of white folks moved in. So, and that's a very different kind of gentrification. I think less fraught, and which is when you have areas that are non-residential, or they're post-industrial uses or whatever, you change them so people live in them. I think there's a difference there. I want to talk, though, about what policies create gentrification, how that can be problematic sometimes in terms of displacement. An example here in Brooklyn with the new Brooklyn Nets right after this. Talking about gentrification and diversity and integration, I mean, that to me is the key thing here, right? It's that and the reason that integration is so important, as I said at the top, is that we are going to be a more diverse nation, right? So at the micro level, right, when we're like living close to each other, how do we create the conditions to produce integration, diversity, harmony, even if I can sound like a hippie for a moment? And Michael Bell, there is a work that is at play here, and one of those is, we see a lot of development incentives, even in a place that like downtown Brooklyn that is already a hot real estate area. There's still the city's still giving tremendous amount of development incentives. We saw a huge epic titanic battle over the Barclays Center, which is where the new Brooklyn Nets are going to play, and there was a multiracial coalition of people in the area fighting it. Some people say that's just classic not in my backyard, they don't like development. Some people say no, it's going to destroy the diversity of the neighborhood and displace people. And clearly the Nets are a little worried about this. I want you to take a look at this trailer as they sell themselves to their new neighborhood.
We've also been the underdogs, waiting for our chance. And now, Brooklyn, we root for the same cause because we believe in the same things you do. That neighborhood is family. And loyalty never goes away.
I love that because it's just it's good, but it's addressing head on What do you when you see big development plans like happened at Barclays Center, when you see incentives being given for development, what do you make of that as policy?
Well, you know, first of all, I was just saying, I'm an architect, but I got deeply involved with urban design and housing, largely trying to figure out, you know, how to be an architect. And when you teach, you have to contextualize what you do. And architects often feel embattled, unempowered in these big situations. So the reason I say that is because if you look at something like the Barclays Center and that redevelopment, there's, unlike Memphis or Houston or anywhere else, I mean, it's a transit issue, for example. That zone, I think, has 13 subway lines. Yeah. And the city knew it was a deeply undervalued transit hub. So the degree to which it's gentrification or urban development, it is also a kind of transit question. I think the other side of it is that you have to look at with Barclays after 9/11. The city really made a major effort at rezoning countless places in an effort both to increase density and livability, et cetera. Well, maybe not livability, but to combat job loss to New Jersey or to Connecticut. Right. So the gentrification issues there are real, but it was already a kind of, and I could get a lot of flack for contextualizing it this way, but it's in a much broader macro problem too, which is cost of transportation, which is good for the working class.
I mean, well, that's part of the right.
If part of the holds these days.
That's well, part of the issue here, and this is something that I wrote about when I lived in Chicago, is that part of the problem we've seen with development in major urban areas. Remember that urban population actually grew for the first time, right? Yep. I don't know if it was between 1990 and 2000 was when it grew for the first time in the top major 10 cities inside the city boundaries, not the metro areas. Yeah. Metro areas are always growing.
Los Angeles, yeah.
That you're seeing a greater space grow up between where jobs are and where affordable housing is, right? I mean, I saw this in Chicago where, you know, increasingly, particularly during the housing boom, working class folks had to move further and further and further and further outside the city, 40, 50, 60 miles. The jobs were on some other side of the, and you know, the huge commutes as a result.
I just want to say, you know, it's two things that undergird this entire conversation and never get brought up.
Please.
Okay, so the first thing is there's a wealth gap, a huge wealth gap between African Americans and the rest of the country, really, but particularly between African Americans and white Americans. And we often ask housing policy to answer for that.
Interesting.
You know, but it's a much bigger macro issue that I don't know that housing policy can necessarily solve. The second thing is you want services. We all want services in our community. We all want good commerce in our community. We want diverse commerce in our community. We all want better schools. How in the world do you get those things and not expect prices to housing prices to rise?
Absolutely.
And as long as you have gap, and as long as you're asking for those things, I don't know how you resolve that tension right there.
That's a great point. If a neighborhood has good transportation, a good housing stock, good schools, then it's a desirable neighborhood, the price for which will get bid up.
I mean, in New York, there's always this thing of, I wish it was 1978 again. I mean, is the answer to go back to the
really?
past? I don't know if there's that. What is this idea it was cooler then, you know, or something like that? So it's like, I mean, really, do you want to go back to the past? I mean, do you want, you know, a slum, you know, in service of it remaining black or remaining as it was? I mean,
but I think that's straw man. Is anyone really arguing for that?
No, but it's, I mean, we're on cable TV, so I forgot I was on your show, though, so I guess I can't say that.
I would love to raise, and my question is really to the Congressman. If you look at, for example, at Marion Barry's Ward 8 in Washington, D.C., it's one of the poorest neighborhoods in the Washington metropolitan area. And if you look at that neighborhood and neighborhoods like that across the country, I sit back and I ask myself, why is it, for example, that you can't get premium grocery stores? Why can't you get good public schools, you know, really highly effective public schools in those neighborhoods? Why is it that these children that live in these neighborhoods are forced to live in, for the most part, what is a food desert? And what can we do from a policy perspective so that integration or gentrification aside, people can live wherever they want to live and have the services that they deserve? And so my question to you is, I mean, what can be done from a policy perspective? Because that's the real problem.
Congressman, I want you to answer that question, but we got to take a quick break first.
Up with Chris Hayes.
Brooklyn, we go hard. A little bit on the nose. I'm seeing on Twitter, just to update, we were talking about immigration, Mike Allen is reporting Romney twice declines to say if he would undo Obama's immigration order. That's going to be interesting to see if he can make it to November without answering that question. I suspect he can't. Michelle Bernard, you're just asking the congressman, how do you create a policy framework that allows for there to be amenities and opportunities and publicly accessible public goods, even in neighborhoods that aren't.
Yeah, they're in low-income neighborhoods.
We put a bill in because we've got food deserts in Memphis, which most inner cities have, to give incentives to grocery stores to move into the inner city. It hasn't moved, and it's not going to move until there's a Democratic Congress. Maybe it can move. But there can be tax policies that do direct and give opportunity for grocery stores. Michelle Obama's doing a great job, and there's a lot of gardens and farms that are starting to kind of come into inner cities, and people growing their own in the legal way. And
Walgreens, you made that distinction for our audience.
Walgreens has talked about doing more vegetables and fruits in the inner cities, and I've encouraged them to come to Memphis first. I wanted them to come on Dr. King's birthday and publicize our Grizzly game with the Bulls and have it there. But there's opportunities, and I think Walgreens, for one, sees it, and they're going to start trying to do it. But it's tough.
One of the things I think at a federal level we should also note, when you're talking about that, is that, look, this is a place where at the level of federal policy, cities, and particularly the actual, not just metro areas, actual in-city boundaries and dense urban areas, are entirely represented essentially by Democrats in Congress. They do not vote for Republicans, and they are the Republicans don't care about them, more or less. And I'm not saying this because they're bad people. I'm saying from a political constituency standpoint, they don't represent them. They're not getting their votes. That's not where the influence is. Urban policy and this kind of thing, it's just not going to move very much unless there's a Democratic Congress or a Democratic president.
Right.
Michael, let's talk about the role that subsidies play, because that's a big part of it. Ta-Nehisi, you're saying you're covering the fight over Walmart coming into the west side of Chicago. Development doesn't happen just in a vacuum, and a lot of times the government is actually, when you see these big stadium deals, for instance, which are just, in most cases, just totally scandalous, right? They're just absolute taxpayer footing the bill.
Ours was not scandalous in D.C.
It was, well, yeah.
I chaired the agency that did it. We literally did a public-private partnership. Abe Poland paid $200 million of his own money to build.
Right, no, that one. Yes, exactly.
Arena.
You're talking about the arena.
The MCI arena, which is now the Verizon Center.
Yes, the Verizon Center. But we see this as a rule, right? That government subsidizing private interest to develop.
Well, I think contextualizing some of these things, which, as an architect, you end up trying to find out what's controlling this world. Architects love to think they have a lot to do with shaping territory, but they, of course, have not that much. Just in the case of New York City, the other night, the MoMA had a conference around the foreclosure show, which is why I was here the last time. Mark Yar from the Housing Development Agency for the city, he made an incredibly lucid argument about the billions and billions of dollars that New York City has spent on trying to produce affordable housing in the last 20 years. But his point was their failure, but the degree to which the world we have is far from organic.
Right.
And it is laden with directives and initiatives. And in his case, this was a positive thing, of course. But I bring that up because the other side of it is we were talking about unintended consequences before we came on. The Brooke amendments in 1969 set public housing rent rolls at 30% of household mean income, and it was meant to be a positive thing in the broadest sense. It was Senator Brooks from Massachusetts, but it ended up basically diminishing the diversity of constituencies within public housing because it raised the rent on certain people. So people whose rent went up left, and you ended up with more of a homogeneous stratum of a demographic, which by 1998, the Quality Work and Housing Responsibility Act starts to try to undo and produce more mixed income. So I think this, to me, is the reason I made the personal statement about growing up in D.C. was I feel like there's a lifelong process that we all go through of trying to understand how the world we live in was made. but we're negotiating it very personally.
Right.
So if you are in need of a store, it's a very personal issue.
Absolutely.
But why the store isn't there is not a personal issue.
I gotta raise this point. Because we're talking about race. It's very important that we remember that some people don't like the city. If you were like me and you grew up in a neighborhood, in a city where you did not have space, a lawn, a big house, this was a sign of wealth. And what we're seeing right now is a large number of really middle-class African Americans fleeing our cities, moving down south where housing is cheaper, where you can get that big lawn. These people are not crying you know, and that's not to, you know, diminish the issue of gentrification, to, not to give ammo to say that we shouldn't have policy, but I think that's really, really important.
And that's a really, that massive demographic shift that's happening, which is really a remarkable, and I think in some ways an untold story, right? Because we all know the story of the Great Northern Migration. That's one of the iconic stories in the history of American.
Going back are in much better shape. They're much better educated. They're, they make more money compared to the people who came, to their forefathers who came up. So I think that's important to acknowledge.
Michael Bell, Columbia Professor of Architecture, Ta-Nehisi Coates from the Atlantic Magazine. Great to have you here for this discussion.
Thank you.
We'll do it again.
Thank you very much.
What we should know for the news week ahead, coming up next. Just a moment, what you should know for the week ahead. But first, a quick personal update. My book, Twilight of the Elites, is on sale now. And next week, I'll be appearing at events in Washington, D.C. I'll be there Monday, tomorrow night, and Tuesday night. And I'll be in Chicago on Thursday night. You can check out the Twilight of the Elites Facebook page for more details, information about other upcoming appearances. We'd love to see you. So, what should you know for the week coming up? You should know that thanks to a new Homeland Security directive, approximately 800,000 undocumented immigrants under 30 years old who came here in their youth will be able to obtain work permits and no longer have to fear deportation. You should know that prior to this announcement, had already attempted to implement a similar policy by distributing prosecutorial guidelines to immigration officials, but those guidelines were often ignored and further angered activists who've been organizing for years for the DREAM Act. You should know applying sustained political pressure on the White House works. And you should know that while critics are charging the White House with acting politically, sometimes doing the right thing is also good politics. You should know that, remarkably, the House of Representatives has yet to hold a vote on the Senate's version of reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. You should know the act has been for years a bipartisan piece of legislation, but that Republicans now object to provisions that would expand legal protections to victims of domestic violence who are gay, undocumented immigrants, or Native Americans. You should know that the Republicans are doing what they have become so adept at, obstructing the Democrats' agenda by running out the clock. And you should know that Democrat Patrick Leahy and Republican Lisa Murkowski have written to Speaker John Boehner calling on him to hold a vote on the bill the Senate passed. You should know that the Southern Baptist Convention will be held this week, and the denomination will elect its 57th president since its founding in 1845. You should know Southern Baptists emerged from a split with Northern Baptists over slavery, and even after the Civil War, Southern Baptists long supported segregation. You should know that Reverend Fred Luther, Jr. is expected to win the presidency next week, and will, if he does, become the first African-American to lead the Southern Baptists. And finally, you should know that falling gas prices can help at other places other than the pump. On Thursday, we learned that consumer prices fell last month, largely due to gas prices. As we discussed last week, fighting inflation is one of the main jobs of the Federal Reserve, so falling prices give the Fed more leeway to fulfill its other main mission, using monetary policy to help create jobs. You should know the Associated Press reports some economists now predict that Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke will do just that when the Fed's policymakers meet this week. And you should know if this happens, it would seem to disprove the theory I floated last week that Ben Bernanke is in fact trying to get Mitt Romney elected by refusing to spur hiring. You should also know I would rarely be so happy to be wrong. I want to find out what my guests think we should know for the week coming up. I will begin with you, Congressman Steve Cohen.
Well, we'll have probably another extension of the transportation bill. We need to have a transportation reauthorization bill. The House bill did not pass because the Republicans couldn't get their act together. The Senate passed a bill with bipartisan support. We've gone to conference through some unusual route, and the Republicans are still trying to get some of the draconian things in there about the Keystone XL pipeline and coal ash, and coal ash is good for America, according to them, and things like that. But we need a jobs bill, and we need the transportation reauthorization. Our infrastructure is like 20th in the world. We need to be getting back to first. We need to build roads. We need to do things that make commutes to the city easier and have mass transit involved. And so I think they're going to have another continuation, extension. That's because they don't want to give the president the jobs. There will be Tiger grants announced, which is $500 million. That's good, but you need the big jobs. That's what the president. So
you're just saying, I mean, it sounds like what we're doing with a lot of these bills is sort of these temporary extension, kick the can down the road sort of situation. We're not going to get the full bill between Election Day.
We're not going to get anything done. There's going to be an extension until after the election. Then there's not going to be time because the tax cuts and everything Somebody else is going to come up, and then you go to the next Congress. That's a shame, because that's America's future is infrastructure.
Incentive for people to vote for the party in Congress they think can best attack those problems. Michelle Bernard.
I think that what people need to know is that the Catholic Fortnight for Freedom begins on June 21st. It goes June 21st through July 4th. This is a 14-day period of education, a call to action to focus on religious liberty. I think it's important for people to really tune in, see what's happening. We've had a Catholic bishop recently compare President Obama to both Stalin and Hitler. And my colleague Melinda Henneberger at the Washington Post has a fascinating blog. It's called "Is the Catholic Fortnight for Freedom Fortnight to Defeat Barack Obama?" I say this as someone who attends a Catholic church. She's not being anti-Catholic, but I think it's important for people to really listen and see what's happening and see what the Catholic Church is saying with regard to religious freedom and President Obama.
Really interesting. Michael Hastings.
You should know Jose Antonio Vargas, and that writing makes a difference. So I'm going to be a little sappy here. Jose was a reporter who I spent the 2008 campaign with on the bus. Very talented young guy, and took a huge risk by coming out last year as an undocumented worker, risked his career, risked his livelihood, but he kept at it. He kept writing. He took a lot of criticism for doing that. And one of my proudest moments as a New Yorker, my dad, Brent Hastings, was in town for Father's Day yesterday. We were outside 30 Rock. We ran into Jose, and I said, "Dad, this is Jose Antonio Vargas. He was on the cover of Time magazine, and his writing actually made a difference." So if you're out there and you're writing, you're a young journalist, it's an individual decision, but individual decisions can have impact.
I love that, Michael. You are right. And Jose was great on Melissa's show yesterday talking about exactly this issue. We've had him on the program. We'll definitely have him back. Esther Arma.
You should know this name, Melvina. She is a black woman who was born in 1844. And it turns out that she was impregnated at 14 years old by her white slave master. And she is the great-great-great-grandmother of First Lady Michelle Obama. And hers is one of the stories in a brand new book called American Tapestry, the story of the black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama. It's written by New York Times reporter Rachel L. Swans. She'll be in New York on Tuesday, June 19th at the Schomburg at 6:30 p.m. Powerful, interesting story of Michelle Obama's entire ancestral history, a slice of America, but also it has the conversation around slavery and race in a most unexpected way.
Wow, that sounds super fascinating.
It's fascinating. Michelle, and
is that out now? It's out now.
It's just out now, and she'll be in New York Tuesday, June 19th at the Schomburg, 6:30 p.m. On my show on Monday.
Great. Check that out.
Also, you should know, buy your book. Chris Hayes' book rocks. It's awesome, and you got to support this stuff. As a writer, you got to support it.
And it's Father's Day, and he needs to support his child.
Okay, all right. I want to thank my guest today, Tennessee Congressman Steve Cohen, Michelle Bernard of the Bernard Center for Women Politics and Public Policy, Michael Hastings from Rolling Stone, and Esther Arma from New York's WBAI-FM. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next weekend, Saturday and Sunday at 8 Eastern Time. Our guests will include New York Times columnist Ross Douthat and comedian Michael Ian Black. That should be awesome. Coming up next is Melissa Harris Perry. On today's MHP, Melissa makes the argument that corporations aren't working towards the public good and that a corporate president is not the ideal candidate. And she presents an argument for why, in Mitt Romney's framing, Jay-Z would actually make the best president. And white voters may be the tipping point for President Obama's reelection. MHP looks at the numbers to show why white voters should be the voting bloc. We hone in on, ask, what do they want anyway? What do white people want? That's Melissa Harris Perry coming up next. And we will see you next week. Happy Father's Day to y'all out there. Here on up.